Hello, and welcome to episode 123 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We're here today with Don Robertson, former delegate of District 16 in Montgomery County, Maryland, which includes Kensington, Wheaton, Chevy Chase, and Silver Spring. He's the former chair of the Montgomery County delegation to the Maryland General Assembly and served in office from 1971 to 1989. He's also the former majority leader and speaker pro tempore. He's currently an attorney with the Bethesda law firm. Don, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm fine, thanks, Jordan. I'm glad to be here with you. You said District 16, and it was District 18.
District 18. So what I'd like to ask you first is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
Well, I don't know that it would be rather presumptuous to say that I advanced the public interest. I enjoyed and was stimulated by being a public servant. I think being in the legislature, I ran because I thought that we faced a lot of problems and that I wanted to try to make a contribution to try to attempt to solve them.
What are some of the problems that first got you involved in the Citizen Board and civic activism that led to you running for office?
Well, actually, I was elected to the Citizens Committee of the Citizens Committee of the Village of Chevy Chase, Section 3, way back in 1968, and one of the biggest problem that we faced at that time was a state highway administration problem, as a matter of fact, which I later faced as a delegate from Montgomery County.
Yeah, so
but more broadly speaking, I ran for office for the House of Delegates for the reason I indicated, that I wanted to try to make a contribution.
But you saw some big problems. You said with traffic was one of the main.
Well, that was actually, I didn't foresee that. That was just one of the problems that we faced on the on the Citizens Committee of Chevy Chase. But when I ran for the House of Delegates, of course, that was 1970, and the country was still in the and we still are, but we were then 15 years into the civil rights movement. We were then in the middle of the Vietnam War. There was a lot of discord in the country, in the area. I felt that those were major problems. The environment was beginning to be something that people focused on. There were a wide range of problems that faced the world at that time. Some of them still exist. And certainly there were far more than I mentioned just now. But in any event, I felt that I could probably, or at least I wanted to try to make a contribution to try to solve them.
So you mentioned some of the issues like Vietnam, which is a federal issue. So as a delegate, there wouldn't have been much you could have done on that front without running for Congress or running or working on a campaign for a congressman's staff. You know, that issue would have been more difficult to address. But the environment and traffic congestion and development were issues that you may have been able to address as a delegate. What were some of the top agenda items and that you began to execute and were successful at executing or frustrated in executing while you were in the state legislature?
Well, there's a whole range of them, and they've changed over a period of time. Mm-hmm. Let me just say that you're quite right about the Vietnam War being a federal issue. Although we did, a year or two into my first term, there was a resolution in the House of Delegates, probably in the Senate too, expressing opposition to the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. So it probably is not something that the legislature should have dealt with, but it, just as an aside, it did come before us. But the broader point that I was making is that at the time that I ran in 1970, there was a lot of discord on a variety of issues. I felt that people were not listening to each other as well as they should be. Mm-hmm. I felt that I could make some contribution to trying to solve some of the minor problems that, I shouldn't say minor, but problems of lesser significance than the federal government faces. that the General Assembly encounters. And I was involved over the course of the time that I was there in a variety of issues. I spent more time on election law, ethics legislation, but every now and then I would become involved in working on a bill on an entirely different subject, like the Public Service Commission, that kind of thing. But I spent almost all of my time in the legislature from the very beginning with some administrative responsibility. So I spent more time organizing and dealing with process and procedure than I did on sponsoring bills myself.
So,
I was a member of a variety of committees, and I think one of the most important things that a legislator does is play an active role on committees, and I did that. And we were reacting to, on various committees, we were reacting to many different issues.
So let's get a little bit more specific. So you said that you were working on administrative issues, but you also ran for office in order to ameliorate the discord that was present. Was a discord present in the Montgomery County delegation in particular?
No, I'm just talking about
Nationally, societal level.
In society, there were a lot of issues, and I felt that people were not listening. One thing that I felt was that people were not listening to each other as well as they should, and if people listen to each other a little better and recognize the other person's point of view, that some progress might be made to solving the problems.
So it sounds like a lot of what you were doing was really listening, that people weren't listening to each other, so you went to office to begin listening to those whose voices were outshouted.
I went to, as I say, I went with the idea of making some kind of contribution. I really needed to learn how I could make that contribution. One thing I did feel was, and I said in the very beginning, that people weren't listening to each other, but I had a rather indistinct idea of how I could make a contribution at the state level. It turns out that I became very interested in a number of issues and devoted my time and efforts to them when I was there.
Let's dive into those specific issues.
Well, I mentioned I spent a lot of time in election law, ethics legislation.
How did you reform election law and ethics legislation?
Well, you used the word reform. I'm not sure that I would. That I think is a word that not everybody would agree with. But I worked on legislation election legislation that I felt would improve the election administration's process in the state of Maryland. With respect to ethics, the laws were much less developed than they were in election law in 1979, largely because Ben Cardin was then Speaker, had become the Speaker of the House, and really wanted to move forward on ethics legislation. We've been working on that for several years. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of emphasis on that.
And for our listeners who don't know, Ben Cardin, who Don Robertson just referred to, is now the United States senior senator representing the state of Maryland.
That's correct. But at that time, he was a delegate from Baltimore City and he became the Speaker of the House in 1979. And he asked Helen Koss, who was another delegate from District 18, and who was chairman of the Constitutional and Administrative Law Committee, and me, to pull together a lot of different proposals that had been made over recent years to in an ethics bill, and ultimately that bill that we did, and that bill, as it was amended by the committees and by the House and the Senate, became the Maryland Public Ethics Law of 1979.
So does that prohibit lobbyists from giving money or making gifts or bringing legislators out to dinner?
Well, that became no. In the way you stated it covers too much. The ethics law covers conflicts of interest, financial disclosure.
So if somebody makes a contribution to a politician, that politician has to report it to the State Board of Elections.
Yes, but there had already been a reporting process. We pulled a lot of things together and created the State Ethics Commission, which didn't exist prior to that time of that bill that is now the law. But then there were further developments in that process, and Ben Cardin and I both played a role after we left the legislature. I could be off by a year or two, but in roughly 1998, 1998, Senator Cardin had been gone from the legislature for 12 years, but he was asked to chair a committee that would look at proposals to revise that ethics law that I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. He did so, but he left for future consideration the lobbying part of that bill. And the following year, I was asked to chair a task force that looked at the lobbying aspect of that bill to make what suggestions a task force could make as to changing the ethics law to deal more specifically with lobbyists.
Why would you say that's important? Why is it important that lobbyists shouldn't be able to contribute too much money to politicians?
Well, let me say first that I think lobbyists play a very important role because they help to focus the issues before the legislature. They sometimes bring information to the attention of legislators that they don't have. The problem, in my opinion, arises when legislators become too amenable to what lobbyists have to say. And I think one thing that may contribute to that is undue contributions by lobbyists to legislators and to their campaigns. And while I actually can't remember all the specifics at this point, the task force that I chaired, did impose some new restrictions on contributions by lobbyists to legislators. But I should also say that the task force that Senator Cardin chaired a year before on other aspects of the public ethics law also improved that law, so that today it's a considerably different law, or considerably better law than it was originally when it was passed.
Do you have any fun stories of your time working together with Ben Cardin or anybody else from the legislature?
Well, it was a very stimulating and satisfying experience. I don't know that this is a time to go into stories, but it
I think our listeners might appreciate.
Well, no, I don't. I don't know that I can think of a specific story that would be of interest. But it was working closely with Senator Cardin, who was then the Speaker, and the committee chairman at the time, was a very interesting and satisfying experience.
Now, you represented Montgomery County at that time, and yet the Speaker, Ben Cardin, represented Baltimore City. Mm-hmm. Obviously, one would infer that a Speaker from Baltimore City would want to bring home the bacon to Baltimore City. Yet you seem to have had a very great working relationship with then Speaker Ben Cardin. Can you talk a little bit about how you were able to help your constituency, Montgomery County, in light of the fact that the Speaker was from Baltimore City?
Well, one of the characteristics, in my opinion, that made Ben Cardin a very successful Speaker is that he operated by consensus. Now, let me emphasize also that the General Assembly was much different today than I understand it is now. It was not nearly as partisan as it is today. The Republicans were not as well represented. Most issues were decided on philosophical grounds, not on partisan grounds, which made quite a big difference. But it was Ben's forte to try to do things by consensus. Whether a delegate came from Western Maryland or the Eastern Shore or Montgomery County or Prince George's County, he tried, in whatever he was doing, to recognize the needs and of interests of that member and of the jurisdiction that member represented.
So let's talk about leadership. What it sounds like, in your view, then Speaker Cardin demonstrated a great deal of leadership. Can you talk a little bit about what leadership means to you, particularly within the legislative setting, but perhaps more broadly in a civic engagement kind of way, leadership as you embodied it in Montgomery County?
Well, I don't know. I think you lead by example, and I'm not sure that I can really define very well how the characteristics that made me a leader, or either good or bad.
Were you a leader by definition because you were elected, or does leader require some kind of action? Does it reflect upon one man's character?
Well, I think it depends what the position is. In Montgomery County, I was elected chairman of the delegation by my colleagues in the delegation, but
so that's a leadership position.
That's a leadership position, but I think that resulted in large part because I was the vice chairman of the delegation, which and I think I was probably only the vice chairman of the delegation in my first year, which was strange because I was recommended by, at least my understanding is that other people recommended me, non-members of the delegation recommended me to the people who were running the delegation at the time. And then when I had served for vice chairman as a year, the chairman then had to resign because he became chairman of the committee, and then it was a question of being elected by my colleagues. In the House of Delegates, the Speaker really is the person who chooses both the committee chair, majority leader, and the floor leaders, and the committee chairman. Now, the floor leader the majority leader, there has to be read across the desk, and theoretically the members can vote on that, but really the Speaker selects who he wants to have be his voice on the floor of the General Assembly.
Let's pivot this conversation a little bit to your legal career. You have spent decades upon decades as an attorney in Bethesda, Maryland. Have you done anything to advance the public interest in terms of pro bono work or work that you really believe in?
Well, first place, I've only been in Bethesda the last couple of years. I was my office was in downtown Washington for most of the time that I've practiced law. In terms of my practice itself, I would say I don't think there is much connection with the public interest, except that I have provided a lot of service to clients who were not able to afford full payment for the services.
Why did you do that?
Well, it was a question of I recognize the clients' variety of reasons, but there were clients who, for the most part, came to me, and I recognized that they were not able to pay the full amount
before they even came to your door.
That in the early years, before I was a member of the General Assembly, I was appointed to a number of several criminal cases in downtown Washington. So in that situation, I was actually appointed by the court. But in other cases, in other situations, it was my clients who I considered not able to pay the full amount of a private lawyer. But in addition to that, I have from time to time served on a variety of committees that had nothing to do with my legal practice. They were going on at the same time, but I've served on them in order to try to create a better result on whatever subject it was that the committee was working on.
So there was a time within the last few years when the Montgomery County Democratic Central Committee awarded you, Don, a Lifetime Achievement Award. Why did they do that?
Well, actually, I think that award was awarded right after I left the General Assembly. A couple of years ago, I received another award, and I think that was probably more because of age, and they needed to find somebody some recipient for the award. That one was called Democrat of the Year or something like that. Well, I appreciated that, but I don't think I had done any more in that year than I had done in a lot of previous years.
Which might mean only that each year you held a very high bar against.
No, I really don't think so. In the years since I've left the legislature, I have served on several committees, some that I just mentioned, but I have not been very active in the Democratic organization in Montgomery County.
Well, as we approach the end of the podcast, I'd like to ask you to reflect upon your motivations for public service, but now that you have led very many years in the public eye, reflect upon a legacy that your career in public service has created. What is the legacy of Don Robertson?
Well, I don't think that. I think you probably overstated. I don't think that there is any real legacy. But to the extent there is one, I think that probably it is of someone who was elected and who applied himself or herself to the job and accomplished a limited amount as a result of that.
And that has been Don Robertson, former delegate of District 18, former chair of the Montgomery County Delegation, the former majority leader, and the former Speaker Pro Tem of the Maryland House of Delegates, currently an attorney in Bethesda, formerly an attorney in Washington, D.C., who speaks with great humility, precision, and deliberation about his lifetime of service. He does not expect laurels to be thrust upon his head. Don is a man who saw few problems in his own way, according to his words, tried to make a difference by solving those problems in the way that he could, and within the context of many other individuals' efforts and the efforts of larger organizations, he was able to contribute his share. For Don, public service has been a portion, but not an all-consuming identity in his life. There are many other aspects to Don's life, and this aspect of public service, though a common thread throughout his life, is not necessarily the strongest defining feature. It is one feature that has given him some meaning, but with the typical humility that Don greets this sort of conversation, his legacy is much less grandiose than might otherwise be the case. So, Don, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, Jordan, thank you for having me.
And this has been episode 123 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. Remember to subscribe at publicinterestpodcast.com, listen on iTunes or in the podcast app on Apple products. Should you wish to speak to Don, you can leave a voicemail at the phone number listed in the Contact Us tab of the website. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.